Laura, thank you so much for joining. Where are you coming in from today?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brendan. I am hopefully loud and clear from Houston, hunkered down at home. Really, it'd be nice to be working from somewhere else, and I managed to do that a little bit earlier in this, but I'm actually expecting my first child in a week. So we need to be near our doctor, and we're hunkered down waiting for that.
Wow, congratulations. What a unique time on so many respects, like in so many levels.
So many levels.
Yeah. So can you just give people maybe a bit of background on Hines and your company and kind of the breadth of the organization, because it's so diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Hines is sometimes a little bit of a challenging organization to understand because a lot of our partners or investors or tenants or clients work with us in one aspect, but don't necessarily have the full picture. And, I do think that it can be a little challenging. So let me take a step back. We're a global company. So we are currently in, I think, 225 cities around the world, but headquartered in Houston. And we really operate across, the asset class spectrum. So across office, industrial, retail, multifamily, and living. And then we also are vertically integrated in our offerings from, everything from development to investment management, through to property management, engineering, facilities management. And so we really sort of operate across the risk spectrum, across asset classes on a global basis, which can be quite a fabric, quilt fabric to tie together, but also I think creates a lot of opportunities for our firm as we think about how real estate is moving into the future.
Absolutely. And I imagine just being kind of so vertical, but also so horizontal, like that breadth of Hines geographically and with respect to product mix gives you a really unique lens to look at how technology is changing the real estate business. And I'm curious at a very high level, Hines, I think, has always taken a very forward posture on technology and innovation. And where did that come from? Was that kind of always part of your company's DNA? Like, where did that really originate?
Yeah, I have to say, I think it really originated with my grandfather. He has always been an innovator, and he has always seen the value of really getting in the weeds and seeing how buildings operate, what drives them forward. He was a mechanical engineer by training, and that was one very distinct way that he approached real estate, to really be constantly innovating on how buildings operate and how to make them more efficient and better uses of space for the occupant and or the owner. And so that really has been built into our DNA, if you will, that we're constantly looking for ways to really make buildings work better for the end user, or for to make them more efficient for our investors. And especially in recent years, that really has meant technology. And so I think as we've been continuing to push forward and dig in, technology is another tool in our tool belt, if you will, to really improve the built environment.
Yeah, and I imagine just differentiate your product to the end customers. I remember when we first started working together, which was 3.5 years ago, one of the first major initiatives we worked on was what we were calling kind of flexible office, which was that, demand for office space was changing. Tenants were asking for greater levels of flexibility. I think flex office had almost at the time become synonymous with WeWork. I think that's probably no longer the case, probably for good reason. But I remember working with Hines and how we kind of worked with you around your partnership with Industrious and how successful that has been for Hines, for Industrious, for Fifth Wall. But can you just kind of walk through what that partnership looked like from your side of it, from a landlord side of it? How did you view flex office? How did you view Industrious as serving your priorities?
Sure. So, I think you're exactly right that was really one of the first areas we zeroed in on as, an area that's really changing in the real estate industry, and where we felt like we really had a unique perspective to add to the conversation, if you will. And the reason we felt that is because of our vertical integration. And so, I mentioned it earlier, we not only build buildings, but we own them alongside investors and we operate them. And, what we were really starting to see flex space as was, in some ways, an amenity really to our most important tenants.
To the existing tenants.
To existing tenants, yeah, and to and to big enterprise tenants that were looking at sort of their entire space portfolio, and that's a little bit of a different way of approaching it. And when you think about it that way, where it's really part of the package of the building in some ways of what tenants are looking for in their space and the flexibility that space gives them, flex office becomes a way to offer that. And what we saw as an opportunity as being part of the ownership and or part of the management of the building was to really integrate our experience with that of a flex operator and in flex space. Industrious has been such a great partner in that. They really, I think, matched our needs in terms of offering a really high-end, really at the high end of the spectrum of service and quality of the space. And so, I think bringing our experience with, building systems, building designs, as well as our full building management tied in with Industrious's experience at the high end of the flex workspace and the service offering within the flex workspace has been a really, I think, unique marriage that we're really excited about. We've opened our first two locations for the Square in Houston and Salt Lake. And, unfortunately they were open this year. And so it's been a little bit of a, unique start to those spaces. But, we're seeing similar occupancy in those spaces to the rest of the building. And, I think we're actually seeing quite a bit of increased interest in those spaces, really already at pre-COVID levels on that interest, because I think as we move forward, in this current environment and world we live in, I think flexibility is going to become, I'd say, even more important than it was before.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that, kind of how demand for flex office might actually increase as greater flexibility is demanded by tenants and people are working more remotely. But just going back to the Industrious partnership, one of the things that was so interesting from our position to be a part of was, when we first started Fifth Wall, we had this thesis that we could connect these large institutional real estate corporates like Hines to these early stage companies like Industrious. And, one part of that was, the corporates learning from the early stage companies. But the other side of it that isn't talked a lot about is how much the early stage companies, our portfolio companies, can learn from large corporates. And I thought the Industrious partnership just highlighted that so clearly, because I remember Hines's point of view, which is there's a better way to align the incentives of the landlord and what the landlord is trying to accomplish with flex office versus this paradigm that's kind of emerged with the WeWork model of master leasing. And your ability to educate them and enable them to morph and kind of tailor their business model to better meet your needs was really exciting to see, because in some ways you were the genesis of what really transformed that business and made it, I think, probably the most landlord friendly flex option. And that really came from Hines. And that was really cool to see.
Yeah. And just to dig into that, I think the system that WeWork put in place around, master leases, I think, was in some ways necessitated by some of the capital markets requirements of, they wanted master leases in place. They didn't really know how to understand flex office space any other way. And I think what has been great with, with Industrious is two major players, with Hines and Industrious coming together and saying, this is really about an amenity for the building. This has got to be more of a service agreement structure where, yes, there should be upside, and yes, the owner should participate in that to the extent it's there. But, we need to think more holistically about, what this world looks like. And I think now capital markets are catching up to that. And, that marriage is really, I think, leading the way in that.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you look at like what co-working did, it almost kind of reawakened a lot of real estate owners to recognize that brand is actually incredibly important, and exactly the language you're using, which is like, you think about your tenants, you think about your tenants first, their needs, their priorities, and then how does any flex offering, right? Whether it's retail co-working or whether it's flex space for one of your existing tenants and one of your existing floors, how is that congruent with their priorities? And I think what's so interesting about that is it kind of enables the landlord to build real brand equity with their tenants. There's this trusted, more consultative, more dynamic relationship. And it's almost like co-working or flex office becomes a tool in that toolkit, that kind of customer centricity, that mindset.
I think that's right. And we really, we have a very strong view that the real estate world is really moving towards the end user, towards the tenants. And, we are very focused on how do we as a company really orient ourselves to solve, our tenants' broad space needs. And, I think what's exciting for Hines is, as the type of company that we are, that I described at the beginning, that really offers, services across, the risk spectrum, fully vertically integrated and across all asset classes, is we really can come and say, what are your challenges? What are your space needs, issues, complexities, and how can we help you strategically think through them and solve those challenges? But you have to approach it from the tenant first, tenant centricity mindset. Absolutely.
And going back to something you said earlier about, how the demand for flex office changes, one of the interesting things is, like, one of the ways I think about real estate is it's just the commercialization of physical space, right? Like, people need to conduct their lives, and the economy needs to be conducted in physical space, regardless of whether that's a lawyer or a manufacturing company, right? Like, it needs to happen in physical space. And, landlords are trying to figure out, based on location, based on asset type, how do you maximize and how do you build the best relationship with your customers by monetizing space? How do you think the kind of big sociological migration trends that are kind of afoot now because of COVID, how do you think that intersects with flex office? Do you see a world where there's more demand for flex office because the ways people are commercializing space changes?
I think we're still in a period of unknown. So I'll caveat it that way a little bit. But, I do think that what, at least as we sit here today, being in the unknown I think when you're in a period of uncertainty, you value flexibility, right? And, I think that what that means is that companies will continue to increasingly value an opportunity for flexibility. I think especially in the near term, as companies are figuring out how they're coming back, how they need or don't need space and what they want out of their space, I think the more flexibility they can incorporate in figuring that out is going to be valuable. And so, and then, I think beyond that, to me, COVID has really accelerated a lot of trends we were already seeing in the industry. And I think that, as we think about how companies are going to be using office space moving forward, I think in the near term, we've all been pleasantly surprised at how effective we can be working from home. And I think there are some real benefits and lessons to be learned from that. And I think portions of the workforce absolutely will continue to work from home, at least on some sort of partial basis. And, certain portions of the workforce probably will continue to work from home on a fairly permanent basis. I think where that will have an impact on office space is probably more at the commodity level, because the type of work that can be extremely effective over the long term from home, I think is less collaborative and more of sort of the straightforward day-to-day work.
That's what you mean, Laura, by commodity, meaning like it can be done in almost an outsourced kind of distributed fashion. It doesn't need to be done adjacent to the people you're collaborating with.
Exactly. And so I think on the real estate side, the space that will be impacted by that is the more sort of commodity office space that was accommodating that type of work. I think what we are, certainly what Hines is seeing and feeling at our company, is what is missing in a full work from home environment is a place to come together and really establish culture, establish norms, establish working relationships, collaborate, innovate together. It's significantly harder to do all of that over Zoom. And we do really believe that, there is a need, companies have a need for that space to come together and to do that type of work. I think, I think long-term innovation and creativity will be significantly harmed if we don't, get back to space like that. And, in my mind, that's really just accelerating, a trend we were already seeing about, office as an experience and creating that experience for your employees where they can be their most productive, their most creative, their most innovative. And so, I think that we'll see sort of that differentiated space really accelerate coming out of this. And I think companies will be working through how they allocate their needs to that type of space, to some flexibility as well for their employees that are coming, maybe spending part of their time at home. And then, probably seeing an impact to commodity office space.
And there's kind of an interesting corollary there, right? With what happened and what has been happening in retail as well, which is to some extent, if you're to use that phrase, kind of commodity retail, which is the notion that you have to go to a physical store to buy paper towels. I think everyone now, it's almost like COVID just accelerated this trend where it was thrust on them. Actually, they don't need to do that. They don't need to go to the store for those things. And in some ways, it's almost put a higher premium on like really differentiated experiential retail, the things that you simply cannot do in a virtual environment. I was having a conversation the other day and it was like, you can't get a haircut virtually. That's always going to happen offline. And that's an extreme example, but just like how brands have thought about building truly differentiated retail real estate that is branded. And if you look at that in the office space, what I'm kind of hearing you say is like, yeah, that the fact that we all were working in the same office, or some companies were, and some people were just staring at their computers all day, not interacting with anyone. Well, yeah, of course that can be disrupted or disintermediated with virtual work. But it's really that more experiential, higher touch, more collaborative, more culturally relevant work around building an organization that it feels impossible to do on Zoom. And I'm curious if, as that's true, do you think the questions that start to get asked of landlords are different? And the reason I think about that is like, I think the questions I would ask today of a landlord around space design and, you know, what I want my office to look like for my employees, they'd be much less premised on like quiet work, you know, the quiet, solitary, computer-based work that is a part of what we do. And it would probably be much more focused on collaborative work and culture building activities and team cohesion. So do you think that starts to change for companies big and small?
I think absolutely. And I think, you know, as companies then start to think about what their space is within buildings, they're going to be asking questions of their own space of, you know, how much space do we really need for the quiet work within our footprint, versus how much are we really dedicating to that collaborative, you know, aspect of how we work and what's important there. And I think then in terms of what they may ask of landlords is, what does your building offer? And what does the surrounding area or location or, you know, integrated how the building integrates into the fabric of where it sits? What does that do for my employee base to, you know, to really get to that next level of work, where they are really pushing forward, and it's you know, it's something that we can't do anywhere else. What makes your space unique to help my company create a culture and really push its work? And so, you know, it's a hard question, but I also think, frankly, it's not unexpected. It's something that we've been working towards, you know, I think for several years, and in that, you know, that is where the future of work has been going. And this is really just accelerating it and putting it more at the forefront.
I think about it like there's that, you know, that old adage, like, how do you make a house a home, right? Meaning like, how do you endow it with, you know, this emotional charge and this sentimentality? And that's obviously, you know, on a more personal level, but it's kind of like the same thing in office, right? Which is like, how do you make an office that is endowed with like the place, the resting place of your culture, right? Where your team comes together. And that's a different calculus, I feel like, for tenants. I wanted to ask you about something else, because in some ways there are all these trends that, as you mentioned, were happening well before COVID that have now just been accelerated. But one of the things that feels at least newer, although it wasn't actually new, it's just more, it dawned on us, is this intersection, this conjunction between like public health, right? And the responsibility of keeping a city or a society safe with respect to a pandemic like the one we're in now, and the physical spaces we inhabit. And I know you've entered into this really interesting partnership with the Mayo Clinic. Can you just talk about how Hines has taken a forward posture around public health and real estate?
Sure. You know, I think it's a really interesting question. And again, I think you're exactly right that this was already on people's minds leading into the pandemic, in the sense that, you know, I think we've always believed that, well, maybe I'll take a step back and say, you know, sustainability as a concept has always been a core tenet of what Hines has valued, and what we think makes, you know, is critical to making a building really highest quality and sort of the best contribution to the community in which it's in, as well as, you know, for its tenants and investors. And, you know, I think one thing that, you know, has evolved in our thinking over the past many years has been that sustainability not only includes how a building impacts, its environment, but also how it impacts the well-being of the people that are working and spending time within it. Not the well-being, the health, the productivity, etc.
And what's
And
interesting
so,
just on that is I feel like it's almost not the responsibility of, the occupants of a building to think through that. And it's really the landlords that are now really having to think through these questions. And it feels a bit like office tenants, or the occupant of any building is now realizing how much responsibility they put in the hands of their landlords, and
yeah.
how gravely that responsibility is being taken.
Yeah. I mean, you could almost see it a little bit like how LEED has evolved for sustainability, where, there is a big component that is the responsibility of the landlord relative to the base building. And then there is there's a component that's also the responsibility of the tenant that, has LEED space within the building to, help support that sustainability effort. I think the same could be applied to wellness, in that there are some responsibilities, on the shoulders of the landlord for the base building and what, the building as an envelope can do. And then there are things that tenants can do for, within their space for their own employees to be thinking about that as well. And, as we started to develop this thinking, we, back in 2017, really became a founding partner of the Well Living Lab, which is really run out of the Mayo Clinic, to start thinking about how does space affect, our wellness, our health, our productivity, and how can we be part of thinking, some forward thinking about where that should be going. Obviously, this is a very obvious example of how COVID has accelerated some of the priorities and thinking there. We've spent some time internally in Hines, and our thinking is that well certification, the priorities around well are going to become as important, if not more important, than priorities around LEED and sustainability. And so I think this becomes an incredibly important aspect for the real estate industry. We're really excited about the work that has been going on over this past 6 months or so through the Mayo Clinic and the Well Living Lab. It's also a partnership with Delos and Cushman and Wakefield to really be thinking about, what are the impacts of, our air systems within our building relative to the spread of COVID, and more generally, how do we need to think about distancing within space, and how can we help companies think about a return to, to the office space in moving forward. And I think all of this research is really, it's a combination of, scientific research with, the physical implementation of that. And, what we're trying to do is really lend our perspective to think about, how can we take scientific findings and make them really applicable and actionable for real estate space, and for those who are who own space, who manage space, and who use the space. The three big areas that we're spending time on are focused on, one, air and everything related to, ventilation, filtration, temperature, humidity, how air flows through spaces, and what impacts those have. The second is surfaces, and what we need to be thinking about relative to surfaces and high impact opportunities there. And then the last piece is human behavior. And so, I think really continuing to push forward on that front. I'd say it's a little bit early to have absolute conclusions out of that, but I think really such a big opportunity as we, are all learning and trying to move through this.
Right, and so important, obviously, and timely. And you mentioned, both human behavior and surfaces, which just makes me think of something I know we've talked a lot to Hines about, which is like, how do you make buildings smarter, right? Like the number of touch points that an entrant to a building has to have with surfaces and with other people could be eliminated. And in so eliminating them, you do eliminate at least some of the risk associated with a pandemic or pathogen. And so how do you think about the future of what is kind of broadly defined as like smart buildings or connected buildings? Like, I'm not asking for the specifics, but more like at a high level, what does that mean? Like, what should the occupier of a building expect their building to do for them in like 2030?
Sure. I think it's a really exciting and yet complicated space. And it's almost like there is so much low-hanging fruit in this space, but also a lot of challenges connecting the dots across building systems, tenants, owners, and various types of technology. I think that we really think about it in terms of, again, coming back to sort of that tenant-centric experience. What is, and I think this is how you ask the question, which is the right way, is what should a tenant expect, and what do they really need out of their building to make their experience better, and then how can technology and sort of the connected smart building help to contribute to meeting that need or exceeding that need, if you will. And so, I think it's an area that we're focused, and I think the challenge that we have is just how dispersed some of this technology is, and how you bring it all together in a way that is truly interconnected. I think things like COVID will accelerate certain types of technology, as you mentioned.
Right.
But I think it's going to take some time to really march toward a place where we can bring all of this technology together in a way that is seamless. Because I think until it's to the point where it is fairly seamless for the end user, it's still not quite there.
Yeah.
But we certainly see the opportunity, and we've been working with you guys quite a bit to evaluate, where do we start to push into, where, knowing we're not going to have the full package on day one, what are the most impactful smart technologies that we can start to integrate into our buildings in ways that that make sense and will have the most impact for our tenants or for our end user. So I do absolutely believe this is where the world is heading. This is where real estate is heading. As I think about as well from our perspective, from the owner's perspective, all the, and from a manager of the building's perspective, both of our hats, if you will, all of the information and data that can and could come from, a much more connected building only helps us to do our job better and serve our tenants better. And so, we're very focused on the opportunity to really push into that and sort of make it a virtuous cycle. But, I think we still feel like there's some steps along the way to get there.
But also how exciting, right? For Hines
Absolutely.
As an organization with such a global footprint across so many different asset classes. I mean, it's complicated. I totally appreciate that. And the vertical integration probably makes it more complicated, but just what an awesome opportunity to pursue. Well, Laura, this has been really interesting to just get your perspective on all this. And thanks so much for chatting today, Laura.
Yeah, thank you. And Stay well. Hopefully get some good hiking in those mountains that I'm seeing behind you.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to probably take my dog out for a hike after this. So thanks, Laura.
You look pretty relaxed back there. I don't
Yeah,
know.
she basically sunbathes while I'm while I'm on calls all day. She's got a rough.
I've got my two dogs behind me, so it's the way to go these days.
Well, thanks again, Laura.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Have a good one.